Hey guys, Nez here. So today I'm going to be taking you through a tutorial on how to upsize your small patterns into large or giant plush. I saw some people talking about this the other day and I thought that I would show you my take on how to make sure that your small plush looks pretty much the same when you upsize it into a giant size. So you can see here I've upsized this Twilight into this giant size here. She's a bit over 3 foot tall. So with all my patterns, I always make the tests of the pattern. I usually test the pattern several times before I make it into the final plush. I always test them at a smaller scale because obviously if I made all these tests that went into the big plush the same sizes that they would be finally, it would just be way too expensive. I'd be using too much material, it would take too much time. It's just much easier to test on a smaller scale. So how do you go from small size pattern to a very large pattern? I saw a thread on Facebook the other day talking about this, and a lot of people seem to think that there was some big secret that you had to modify the pattern, you had to adjust for a certain stretch, thinking that the minky will stretch differently when it's smaller versus when it's larger pieces. And the secret is that you don't have to edit your patterns when you upsize them. I think that a lot of people find that when they're upsizing their patterns from small to large, I think where they're finding that they're having errors in their upsizing is the way that they upsize, not necessarily the pattern itself. So they're making the pattern larger, but it's not exactly the same as the pattern when it was small. So especially when I see people doing, trying to upscale patterns by hand, that's when I see the biggest problems come up. So I recently changed the size of Twilight here, so she's about 16 inches tall here and a bit over 3 foot tall here. And I found a few people say that when they were looking at the life-size one, they said her head is too big. And this is one problem that can come up when you're upsizing plush. The head on the small one is exactly the same size as the head on the large one here. The only thing is, when they're small, you don't really notice it as much because ponies have really massive heads. So you can see here, that the dimensions are almost exactly the same. I'd say the only differences is really in how I've stuffed it, but the proportions are all there. They're all exactly the same. But when you put a giant plush next to a person, that's when it can start to get a little bit strange looking, because a lot of us think ponies are small, they're petite, but really their head is about a third of their height. If my head was a third of my height, that would be terrifying. So one thing you need to consider is, what is your plush going to look like when it's upscaled to a very large size, and do you need to modify it for upscaling? So one thing I would suggest you could do is you could get a little picture of yourself or a picture of a person and just copy and paste that next to the plush and try and scale it so that plush will be, in theory, whatever sizes you want it to be compared to you. So let's say we wanted Twilight to be as tall as me. I could get a picture of me and put it next to her and think, okay, is this head really large? Is it going to look strange? So that's something just to consider, especially with characters that sort of have chibi-ish proportions, which ponies are especially, because their head is just so large in comparison to their body. It's just not so noticeable when they're little. So once you've got your pattern finished, you're going to test your entire pattern before you upsize it. Don't go making a pattern and then blowing it up to 3 foot tall and thinking that it's going to work, because you're going to waste a lot of time, a lot of fabric. You really want to make sure that your pattern is perfect in every single way before you blow it up, because like I mentioned, things when blown up, they're going to look more obvious. They're going to be right there in your face. So if your proportions are off when your plush is small, they're going to look a bit strange, or even more strange when you blow them up and it's right in your face that those proportions might be a bit off. So what you need to do is, instead of drawing your pattern out on a piece of paper, if you have done this, that's fine, but you need to scan it and digitize it. You need to bring your pattern into Photoshop or another digital drawing software, and you need to have it all digitally drawn, because the ways that we're going to upsize it are all digital. Because if you do it by hand, it's really hard to copy by hand a small pattern into a large pattern. Maybe you could do one of those things where you draw the grid on one and then draw a larger grid and try and match it up, but really, if you want it to be perfect, I would really suggest digitizing your pattern in some sort of digital software, and then we're going to blow it up that way. So here we have a pony pattern that I've made before as an example for a tutorial in one of these videos. Let's just say this is the entire pattern here. So you have your entire pattern in Photoshop or whatever digital software you want to be using. Now what we need to do is we need to sew out a test of this, and we need to measure exactly how tall it is. So you want to get out your ruler or a measuring tape, try and measure exactly how tall it is, try and be as close as you possibly can with the measuring, because if you're off with your measuring it's going to upscale and be off. So the further you're off, the further it's going to be off when the thing is large. So let's say that this pony is 16 inches tall, which is about the size of my normal ponies, up to its neck. And so we want to make it, let's say we want to make it into a life-size pony. Let's say it needs to be 2 foot tall instead. So what we're going to do is we're just going to do some really basic algebra. I know that sounds terrifying because I've forgotten everything I learnt in school about math, but it's really simple. All you need to do is go, so the pony is 16 inches tall, and then what do we need to times that by to equal the 24 inches? So what we need to do is, instead of having 16 times y, we bring it over to the other side. So y would equal 24 divided by 16. And then if we get our calculator, we go 24 divided by 16, and that's 1.5. So this pattern needs to be scaled up 1.5, so 150%. So 1.5. And that's how much we need to upscale it. So you'd be surprised, you know, the number's not going to change massively, but it is really going to leap in size once we actually change this pattern, and it is going to hopefully make our plush exactly 24 inches tall. If you have measured correctly, and if you sew exactly the same and stuff exactly the same as you did on your original test, you should get exactly the height that you want. Sometimes you can be off, maybe an inch or a few inches depending, but I find that this is the closest and easiest way to get an exact size. So now that we know it needs to be upsized 150%, what we need to do is we go into your digital software. There should be an area where you can change the size of your image. So I'm going to go image size. So you can see, you know, how many inches, how many centimetres or whatever the dimensions of your pattern, your entire canvas are. What we want to do is we want to go into percent. So this is currently at 100%, and this is giving us a 16-inch plush. So we want to make sure that the percentage is locked. So if you don't want to make it 150% wider and not taller, it'll stretch it out funny. So I'm going to put 150% in there and click OK. So if you can't find out how to do this on your software, have a Google, have a look around. There should be free softwares out there that can upscale your plush by percentages. So you can see that our image jumped to being a bit bigger. So let's see how much it actually jumped. So this pattern should be large enough to make it so that our body comes out at 24 inches tall. So if we go back to our original size image, if I paste the new size on top of it, you can see just how much bigger it is. So you can see this should be 1.5 times overall bigger than our original pattern. Now that you've done this, I'll go back and I'll upsize it again. What we want to do now is we want to put in a little guide to help us upsize the plush. So what I like to do is I like to go and make a square, and you can make the square any size, but try and make it an easy number to do math with. So I'm going to do a square that is 10 centimetres by 10 centimetres. So I'm just going to draw that out in this software, and that'll show how big a 10 centimetre square is in proportion to this body here. Right, so now we have our 10 centimetre square. I'm just going to put this somewhere on the page. Just reduce the opacity. We're not going to be printing this out or anything, it's just going to help us upsize our pattern with a couple of the methods that I'm going to give you that you can use to upsize the pattern. Now, if you're like me and you don't mind wasting printer paper, the easiest way to do this, to print this out, obviously it's too big to fit on a single piece of paper, but I just like to chop it into a whole bunch of pieces and print them out, then sticky tape them back together. I find that that's the easiest way. The other ways are a little bit more tricky. You need a little bit of different equipment that you may or may not have to upsize. So what I would do is I would create a piece of paper the size of what I want to, the piece of paper that I can print at, and then I'm going to take my pony body, copy that, paste, and you can see here, I could just chop this across here, draw a line, print this piece out, draw another line here, print this piece out, etc, etc, just chopping them and then gluing them together. Now, if we're making a life-size pony, you're going to have your pattern pieces being much bigger. You might have them sort of like this size or even larger. You may need to chop it, this way and then drag it across and then print the leg in several pieces. I did this for the last life-size pony that I made. I mostly did it because I didn't want to transfer that pattern onto something more permanent, because I really very rarely make life-size ponies. The last time I went to all the effort of transferring the pattern onto nice physical paper that would last a long time, I never made a life-size pony using that pattern again. It's been years since I've made one. So just keep in mind, do you mind printing out a bunch of pieces? It's probably the easiest way, even though it takes a little while, but if you're only going to be upsizing this pattern once, that's probably what I would do. Now, if we're going to be using this pattern a whole bunch of times, there's a few things that you can do to make it more permanent and ways to blow up your pattern even bigger and not have to worry about the restrictions of printing on single pieces of paper. So the first thing you can do, which is just, probably the easiest way to blow it up without you having to do very much at all, is just go down to your local printers, bring them the file and get them to print it at the correct size. So let them know what DPI the image is, let them know the dimensions, and they should be able to print it on a huge piece of paper for you. But if you don't want to do that and want to be able to do it at home, here's how I do it. So first off, you choose your paper. I personally like to work on watercolour paper when I'm transferring patterns that I'm going to be using over and over. You don't need to get the super expensive stuff that's like the beautiful torn edges and the, very textured kind of thing. You just want something. You could even use cardboard. You want something that's more sturdy than regular paper. So when I went to art school, we had a little art shop underneath the university, and they sold massive pieces of watercolour paper. They were huge and they weren't very expensive. It was sort of the cheapest option sort of thing. So go to an art shop if you can and have a look at what kind of big pieces of card or paper they have. Just get something that's a bit more sturdy than your standard printer paper. So when you've got your paper, there's two options for upsizing that I've personally used, and it depends on how much money you want to spend and how lucky you can get finding one of these for cheap. So this is how I upsized my first life-size plushie for Rainbow Dash. I bought this. This is just a really cheap little digital projector, and you hook it up by USB or HDMI to your laptop or your computer, and it projects the image of whatever's on the computer onto your wall. Now these usually go on sale. I think I got mine for $80 or something like that. I know it's a little bit pricey, but if you're going to be making a plushie that costs $1,000 worth of material to make, I would invest in this to make sure that you can upsize your pattern correctly. It's probably even cheaper just to go and get it printed at your local printers. It'd probably cost you under $10 or something like that. But anyway, have a look for these. I would suggest starting to look for them at sort of second-hand shops. We call them op shops here in Australia. Thrift stores, I think they're called in the States. But start looking for these. You can really find them. People just throw them away when they don't need them anymore. So keep an eye out. I've actually now found a really high quality one of these worth about $3,000 at a secondhand store, and I think I got it for like $30. So keep an eye out as you're shopping and looking around places like that, because you might be able to score a really nice projector for a really cheap price instead of having to buy one brand new. The only thing I would warn you about is with these cheap ones like this is the one that I bought, they don't really have a very good resolution, so you can only blow up the projection so much. If you bring it too far away from the wall trying to get it too large, it's going to start getting a little bit pixely. So the better with the projector, the bigger you can blow up your pattern. Or you could just break it up into different pieces and, you know, just do the body and then just do the head, so you don't have to include the whole, every single piece on your wall. So an even better option, and something that I've recently purchased, is one of these old school, you know, school projectors. They sort of look like this. You would have seen them, unless you're a lot younger than me. They used to be everywhere at school. So essentially you put a little clear piece of, it's like a clear paper, I guess it's a film. You place that onto the surface here, and then, you know, through magic, the magic of science, it projects the image of whatever is on this piece here onto the wall, and you can really project it very, very large. Now again, this is something that you're going to have to find secondhand. I don't even know if they make these anymore, but I assume they'd still be quite expensive brand new. But just keep a lookout at secondhand stores. You can look online. I think things like you guys have Craigslist. We have a website called Gumtree here in Australia, or even Facebook groups of just people local to you selling things. I think I paid about $60 and I got a really nice one of these with a trolley, like the old school trolley that it used to be pushed around on. So these are really nice because you don't really have to worry about the resolution. You can blow things up really, really large. All you'll have to do is you'll have to print out your pattern onto your piece of paper, then go buy some of that clear film. The stuff that you can print on is really expensive, but you can buy stuff that you can draw on for really cheap. I got a packet of like 100 sheets. It was really cheap. It was like $12 or something like that. So go for that if you want to save money. And then I would simply just lay your plastic piece over your printed pattern, draw it out with a Sharpie, and then you can blow it up that way. So back to why we drew the little square. The square is for when you're using a projector to upsize your pattern. So what we want to do is, like I said before, do you remember when we were upsizing this pattern, we needed to upsize everything by 150%? So if this square is 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters, if we times it by 1.5, we're going to end up with a 15 centimeter square. So that means that when you're having your projection onto your wall, you know, you stick your piece of paper onto the wall with some tape or whatever you want, you're going to adjust the size of your projection until this square is 15 centimeters by 15 centimeters, so you can just get a ruler and measure it on your wall. So that's how I like to make sure that everything is blown up to the correct percentage. You use this little square as a reference. I mean, you could also just, you know, you could measure how long this hoof piece is, measure a straight line, and then do the same thing. But I like to use the square just to make sure that the projection is actually at the correct dimensions, in case, I don't know, maybe your projector makes things a little bit wider than they're meant to be. Then you can go, oh, this square is wider horizontally than it is vertically. There must be something wrong here. So that's just what that little square is for. So when you've got your projector going, I would suggest definitely doing it at night time, because during the day you'd really have to black out all your room that you're doing it in to really see the projection clearly. So get everything ready during the day, so at night time, as soon as it gets dark, you can pop that projector on and then you can trace out all your pattern pieces. Remember to add all your little markings and things. Like on my patterns, I like to mark points so I can align the gusset to the actual pattern, and like things like halfway points on the hooves and things like that. But afterwards then you can just cut them all out of that thicker card or paper, and you have your pattern upsized. It should be upsized perfectly. So really, you only need to worry about how you're going to stuff your plush. If you stuff it correctly, then your small plush should come out looking pretty much exactly the same as your large plush, or vice versa. One thing that might put this off is if you've used stuffing to really extremely change the shape of one of your pattern pieces. So if you've stuffed the head till it's almost popping, it's absolutely stuffed to the brim to get it to be round, for example, you probably aren't going to be able to achieve the same level of pressure on your final head or your final piece. So just keep in mind that if you're really forcing a shape with stuffing on a small scale, that's probably not going to work on a large scale. You're going to need to make sure that your pattern achieves those shapes that you want without really having to manipulate it with stuffing, if that makes sense. You're also not really going to be able to do thread sculpting as much. If you find a needle that's big enough to go all the way across a life-size pony head, let me know. I think you probably have to make one yourself. I don't know how you would do that. But even my longest doll needle, which is like a foot long, is not big enough to do thread sculpting on things like a giant pony's head, whereas I would usually do a little bit of thread sculpting on my smaller ponies. But I find that the embroidery, for some reason when you're doing life-size ponies, their front views seem to look better than the small scale. I don't know if it must be something that actually to do with the stretch of large-scale embroidery that is affecting the way it sort of curves around the face. But anyway, that's enough of me rambling. That's pretty much how I upsize my patterns for giant plush. I do it all the time. Every single big plush that you've seen me make has started off small scale in many, tests at small scale, and then I've upsized them using that sort of algebra method, digitally upsizing them, and then every single time I've used a projector, or I've used just manually printing out a heap of different pieces and wasting a whole lot of paper, obviously recycling it afterwards, and using that to create my giant pattern. But I hope you guys found that helpful. There really is no big secret to upsizing your patterns other than correctly doing the upsizing itself. You aren't really going to notice, anything being thicker or thinner unless there's differences in, as I mentioned before, how you're stuffing something. But generally it should be close enough to look very similar to your original. So I hope you found this useful. If you have any questions, don't be afraid to send me a message. I'm online pretty much all the time. Really happy to help you out. Don't worry about it at all. But yeah, I hope you learned something. I hope that this gives you some confidence into starting to upsize some of your patterns into giant plush. Just be careful and just follow all these steps to make sure that you're upsizing it correctly, because as I mentioned before, it can be an expensive mistake if you accidentally do something wrong along the way, because ponies like these can cost almost $1,000 worth of materials, at least I've found. So anyway, enough rambling. I'll see you guys in the next one. Feel free to send me a private message if you need any help. Bye!